All right, here we go with another true Brew Bobcast here at the end of Détente Road at Cafe Détente. We've been trying to get together for a while. I want to introduce this very special guest, Dr. Elista Istre. Did I pronounce that right?
Elista Istre.
Elista.
Yes.
Thank you so much for correcting me.
You're welcome.
That would have been awkward if I did that the whole time. Elista.
Yeah.
Welcome to the cafe.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we were finally able to make this happen.
Yeah.
Took a while.
Well, plenty of subject matter that we can discuss today. If you don't mind, can we talk about the Creole book first?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating story. Like, I read it 3 times.
Really?
Yes, I did. So I guess to start off, when did you become this curious historian, mysterious finder person? When did that bug hit you?
Oh, I was a kid. I mean, I've always loved history. I've always been interested in people and cultures. I remember in the 3rd grade is whenever I discovered world history. And I had a textbook, and we were on a family road trip somewhere, and I don't know how I got a hold of my book ahead of time, but I did. And I was just reading that history book on this whole road trip across the country. And I was like, wow, the pyramids and ancient Greece and all of this stuff. And I don't know, I've always liked it. And then going through school, I liked school. I thought, I need to go to college. It's the thing to do. And then it's like, what am I going to study? Well, history. I love history. I love culture. Right. So I did. And I think it's always been in there. I mean, I look back on pictures when I was a kid, and I was dressing up my siblings like, in historic-ish, costume-ish things as a kid. So I think it's always been there. I don't remember a time where I didn't like it, to be honest. And I think with the Creole part of it, as it relates to the book, I give a lot of presentations on culture and people and history. And I've been doing that for over 20 years now, whether formally or informally. Because I used to run Vermilionville. I was a program manager, so the village, that was my job. So I was interacting with the public, giving 2-minute talks, giving 2-hour staff meetings, whatever it was. I just was doing a lot of those types of things. I've always liked it. But what I discovered in giving a lot of presentations to the public was that people generally, even people out of state, generally have an idea of what a Cajun is. But Creole is just so complex. And very few people 25 years ago, wanted to talk about it or wanted to broach that subject. And some people did. And sometimes the results were things that the Creole community were not happy with, to be quite frank.
With the history that came out, or to talk about it in general? Was it still kind of taboo or whatever at the time, a little bit, or
some of it was a little taboo.
Uncomfortable?
Yeah, some of it was a little uncomfortable because there's so much complexity within the Creole community. And complicating that, you had folklorists and filmmakers and what have you coming in from outside Louisiana and interviewing what they called Black Cajuns and labeling them as such. And so that was problematic for many reasons. And, and I deal on the folklore side. I do oral history, I do interviews and all of that. So I know how academia can be.
Yes.
And I've strived to stay away from that for many reasons. I have a PhD, but I'm not that person. I hope no one ever thinks I'm that person, because it's like, I don't know, they're culture vultures. They swoop in, they take people's stories, blah, 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 and they go back to wherever they're from. And
you're a guardian. You're a guardian of that. You don't want any of that coming in and misrepresenting anything.
No, because it's very frustrating, and it's inaccurate, and it's not authentic, and the interpretation. I can interview you about a topic, and if you could be telling me anything. I was like, okay, I'll just believe you because I'm not from here. I don't know that you're pulling my leg, you're Yankee baiting or whatever. You're just feeding me a line. And the more I say, oh, wow, the more you keep rolling with it. And then I go back to, I don't know, Minnesota, wherever, and I put this film together, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, these people are so crazy. Well, you interviewed people during Mardi Gras. What did you expect?
Correct.
You're not going to get what's authentic, and you don't know enough about the culture to know what's actually authentic, nor do you bother or care enough to stick around to figure it out.
Right.
And that's the problem that I've seen over and over and over again, not just with the communities here, but just in general. And I got tired of that. I want us to tell our stories. I want us to represent ourselves. We're fully capable of that.
Yes. Well, I'm from here. I'm a born Cajun.
Yeah.
And sugarcane farmers down in St. Mary Parish. And you grew up where? Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Lafayette.
Okay, so you're
Raised in Lafayette.
in Lafayette, and with a last name like East,
Yep.
you're good to go.
Yeah.
So let's dive into the Creole culture. Where is the best place to start the story? I mean, should it be chronological and us talk through that, or where do you think is the best place to start the story of a Creole to the listeners?
Probably just who is a Creole. I mean, that's been so complex, and I think if there's not an understanding of how that term evolved and changed and how it's been used in different places over time, adopted and rejected by people over time for various reasons, if that's not understood, then it's going to be hard to decipher between the other cultural elements that are kind of distinguishing, I would say.
Well, I'm a present to the viewers what helped me a lot, which isn't saying a whole bunch, but I think it's important to understand a little bit of the timeline, and I took the timeline out of your book, if you don't mind me using. But
No.
in the 1560s, so we're several hundred years back, the first using of the word Creole. And stop me if you need to dive into it. I'm gonna fast forward through this. In 1699, right at 1700, Louisiana was founded as a French colony. So the French came in right at 1700. 1718, New Orleans was founded, and the first slave ship comes over. So this 1718. And then a lot of things happened in between there. But the first published word of Creole was 1751, okay? And then in 1765, so we're a couple hundred years before even the Cajuns came on board. So the Creole community started to move and change and all that a couple hundred years before the Cajuns came. Louisiana purchased in 1803, 1812, Louisiana statehood, 1815, the free men of color started to come about, and then, of course, the Civil War. So just kind of wanted to give everybody a basic timeline that the Creole story been around, as your book says, for 300 years. What did I know there's a lot of holes there, but so let's have at it. Tell us what did you find as your definitions of Creole and the best way to start the story?
Well, I think growing up in Lafayette, in Acadiana, in this day and time, when I heard of Creole, I always thought it was black or mixed black, French-speaking black. That's what my definition was growing up. And what flipped everything on its end for me was whenever I had a professor who told me that East was a Creole name. And I looked at him and I said, I don't think so. I mean, have you seen me?
Right.
I'm about as blonde and blue-eyed as it gets. Like, I don't think there's any Creole in me. If they did, somebody jumped the fence a long time ago because it didn't come out. And he said, no, it's French Creole. And I said, what are you talking about? What is that? And so it really piqued my interest because I had never heard that. I mean, I had been told my whole life that I was Cajun. I was raised Cajun. My grandmother swore, we were pure Cajun. Turns out we're actually Spanish Isleño. They were Dominguezes that came over from the Canary Islands during the American War for Independence and all this stuff. But culturally, French-speaking grew up in this area. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers and all that. So culturally, that's what I knew Acacia to be, and Creole wasn't me, is what I thought. And then I started digging deeper, and when somebody says something I've never heard before, it always piques my curiosity. And so I went after it. I said, what does this Creole term mean, and why? And so for me, it was an evolution of the terminology. And then I understood that Creole simply meant born in the New World. And so you could have African, you could have European, you could have even American Indian ancestry, and you could be Creole because it meant you were born here, you were not of immigrant parentage. And that's a big deal because even today, when you have immigrants coming to this country or anywhere, the kids want to assimilate, the kids don't want to have an accent, the kids want to be like all the other kids in their class. And so maybe my parents came from, Honduras or wherever, but I'm from here. I might look Japanese, but my family's been here for 3 generations, so
Right.
I'm from here.
Right.
And that's what Creole meant in the colonial period. It meant that I'm not fresh off the boat. I'm from here,
Well,
and
I
I've
think
been
in your
here.
book it says a Creole is from here, but with roots that are over there.
Exactly.
That made a lot of sense to me. Like that made a
helps
lot
click.
of sense.
Good.
Because you got to almost back up. I mean, this was just Native Americans. So when you start sending people to colonize, that's a whole new thing over there. So I'm from here, but with roots over there.
Exactly. And then over time, the term kept evolving. I mean, the first to start using the term Creole were the Portuguese mariners who were traveling off the coast of Africa in the 1500s. And you can see even some of the artwork, the paintings. You've got this beautiful African woman who's wearing European clothing and gold jewelry, obviously from, you can see the European influence on the African culture in the 1500s. So they were already creolizing the culture. And then whenever all of that started coming into the New World, they brought that with them. And it kept mushrooming. And really, you find Creoles, and this was something that interesting that I didn't know as a kid growing up. There's Creoles all over the world. You got Creoles in Mauritius, Creoles in, literally all over the world. And it's just come to mean a blending of cultures. Somebody immigrated from somewhere, somebody blended with someone, and here we are today, and we're distinct from these other people because of our language or because of our food ways or because of our ancestry, whatever it is, or a combination of all of the above. And I didn't realize that growing up. And when I would go and give talks and presentations, people would always say, well, what's a Creole? Who's a Creole? What is this? And so I did all the reading that I could. There's some books out there that are very good, reliable sources. Many of them are academic in nature. So the general public would be probably not so likely to pick it off the shelf and read it. And somebody told me, well, why don't you write the book? I said, yeah, in all my spare time, just write a book. I've never thought about writing a book. This is not a life dream of mine or like a goal or anything. But the seed was planted, and I saw there was a need for it. And there
Well, I
it
can't
is.
speak enough of the book. I mean, if you're even from around here or not, but for sure, if you're around here, it's a mandatory read. Okay, so, since I read the book the first time, I started to try to really think about how all this evolved and transpired over the years. And I tried to put myself, which of course you can't, back in that place and time. And, I can only imagine first off, you came over on a boat, just a few generations. Now you're on this new land, you know very little of what's happening, and you're forced into this to cohabitate and survive, and meanwhile, back at the farm, they're trying to colonize it, and now you have five different, way more than five languages coming in, and you have to figure out how to communicate. And so it made a whole bunch of sense that Creoles developed their own language just to, this on the slave side, you're trying to communicate, with the master or owner. You're also trying to keep your native tongue. Then the French come in, and so, man, they were navigating around a lot of things, huh?
It was a lot. And the Africans that were coming over spoke many languages. And for them to even communicate amongst themselves sometimes was a challenge because they're coming from different tribes, different nations to begin with. And then they get thrown in as, a long group over here, but they didn't have similar cultures and similar languages all the time. And when I explain it, to field trip kids and things like that, I kind of explain it's like today. If you are, how does the language develop? It develops out of necessity. You have something I need. You have, I have something you want. We're going to figure out how to communicate. And so is it going to be beautiful, perfect grammar? Maybe not. Is it functional? It has to be.
Yes.
And it's just like if you hired a Mexican roofing crew to fix your roof after a hurricane, for example. They might have an English-speaking foreman. It might be an American. But the crew might be composed of Guatemalans, Hondurans, Mexicans, what have you. They all have their own slang, their own little native words that are infiltrated the Spanish that they speak. And yet, when they're communicating with the foreman on the job, they may not have perfect, flawless English, and he's not going to bother to learn Spanish, but they're going to figure out how to communicate and get the job done.
Correct.
And that's exactly how Creole developed. You have all these African languages mixing with French, which French is not always a standardized language. They're coming from different villages and different provinces in France.
Yeah.
Then they're coming to America, where you've got several native languages.
Yeah.
So all of these languages together are brewing, if you will.
Hey, I wrote a couple of them down. So you got Creole language. You called it a curious dialect, or someone did.
Yeah,
You
I see
had,
forte.
Yeah, okay. International French. I'm going to butcher these words. Chai tea, Cajun French, Bambara, Colonial French, Kimbandu, Congo, English, Spanish, Caribbean, and many more. But man, they found themselves here, and they were surviving. It was, and I think the word survival kept coming about because let's talk a little bit about the aristocratic model, which was really a part of the caste system that came from Europe. And I kept thinking to myself, it would have been so much better if they didn't know about aristocratic and caste system, because it seems like they tried to bring that over here instead of saying, hey, we're on a new piece of land, we're on a new planet, let's just start from scratch. They tried to put in a caste system. I mean, was that heartbreaking for you?
Well, I think it just shows human nature, because the aristocratic, if you will, the high society that came across initially to colonize the colony, to make Louisiana something, they were not the eldest sons. They were not, under the feudal system in Europe, you had your peasants, your serfs, your lords. Well, if you owned property, which was very rare, then, the oldest son would inherit the property. The second son might go into the military. The third might, go into the church or what have you. But what happens to the 14th, 15th son?
Yeah.
Like, you're living on your oldest brother's good graces your entire life, and this goes on for generations.
Yeah.
So they were motivated to try something new in the new world. Well, all of a sudden, I'm the king of the hill.
Yeah, they're the big brother.
So, hey, I've got property. I'm a landowner, so let me see what I can do and throw my weight around, because I never had this opportunity in Europe. It has to be, the situation where you're at has to be really, really, really bad. or you must want something a whole lot better than what you have in order to risk everything to cross an ocean. And I don't know if you've ever seen some of the models of these ships. They're so small.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so incredibly small, and you're going across an entire ocean with no motors, no engines, you're depending on the winds. You're hoping there's no hurricanes. I mean, you don't know if there's sea monsters out there. There was so much,
Right.
and you know you're never going to see your family again.
Right.
You probably will not survive, in this environment. So you're taking a lot of risk.
He was almost
Yes.
desperate.
So if you can make it over here and then have some sort of a land deed, whether it's real or not, and you can try to recreate the society that you were escaping, but now you're the top of the ladder, that's what they were doing. And of course it didn't work because they had too many people coming, too many peasants ended up coming over, and there's like, yeah, it's not working.
Right.
It's not working.
So let's talk about that too. So now you're a landowner, Anglo guy, and now you're able to purchase slaves, which is a horrible, dark part of our history. But part of building your own wealth, from what I appreciate, is you just have children within your group.
Mm-hmm.
And so Creoles came out of that, which was, in short, mixed races. But talk about how that led towards free people of color.
Sure.
And talk about, that process, which didn't happen in 2 years. It was sort of generational. And, just sort of how the Creoles sort of spun themselves out into a separate class culture on its own.
Sure. Well, not all the Africans that were initially brought into the colony were brought as slaves. Some of them were free, and they were specifically hand-picked because they knew how to cultivate indigo. They could speak multiple languages. Some of them were court translators. Some of them knew, they had skills in trades, ironwork, things like that.
Mostly the French sent them, or the Spanish?
French.
Okay, so the French was...
Early on, Louisiana was French, and then it became Spanish. It went back briefly to France, and then it became part of America.
Okay.
But previously it was French. So the French were the ones bringing them over initially. And so they actually tried Indian slavery. And it did work because Indians were familiar with the landscape. They just walked back home.
Right.
Like, I don't have to do this, And so the French got very frustrated because, again, you've got these aristocrats coming over trying to recreate this utopian society that did not exist for them in Europe. And so they thought, well, we can just make the Indians subservient. That'll be fantastic. Well, that didn't work. And so they actually wrote in the records that one African was worth 3 Indians because the Indians were worthless as slaves. Mm-hmm. So then...
Good for them.
Yeah. So it didn't work. It didn't work. So it's like, all right, that failed. So let's try something else. Well, let's bring over Africans. And so they started bringing in Africans as enslaved people as opposed to free people. And like you said, a lot of people that came over initially, a lot of the men, I'll back up a little bit, a lot of the men were coming over. The French are not especially known for being good colonizers. Mm-hmm. They send over the military, they send over single men. They make horrible colonizers.
Right.
They shed those wool uniforms.
Yeah.
They go native. They marry Indian wives. They marry African women. They don't really care. Right. They're in the middle of nowhere. You put soldiers in the middle of nowhere.
It's not going to
nothing's really changed. I've worked with a lot of troops over the years. Right. So they don't put down roots. So until you start getting families with women and children and responsibilities and things to help tie people down to the land and make it work the land and that sort of thing, they're just adventurers. They're out, for the experience of it or the opportunity of it. So once the families start coming over, it's like, okay, well, we've been in the colony a while. We need to make a go of this, start importing Africans. And if you don't have enough children to work the land, and if you're wealthy enough to afford extra help as a business owner, you just try to keep moving. You want to build your company. You want to have more employees. You want to have more production. And it just grows and grows and grows and grows and mushrooms into the institution of slavery as it became. But it didn't start that way. And over time, there was many rules, regulations. The Spanish handled it differently than the French did, and what have you. And because of these French men that came over, and Spanish men as well eventually, who did not feel, they weren't coming over with wives and children and families and that sort of thing. So they just had what they called left-handed marriages. The Catholic Church at the time would not recognize a mixed relationship. So they could not legally marry French and African. And you could not legally marry free and enslaved. So a lot of these men would have
concubines and mistresses,
exactly,
and have children,
yes,
because of the legal system. But it produced it produced Creole families.
Yes.
That I think by law, I don't know if this was Code Noir stuff, but he would eventually free the woman, in which automatically freed the children.
Exactly.
And so now you have these communities of Creoles in the prairies, as you spoke there, which was a little different. Let's digress a little bit. From your findings, there were basically four regions of Creole, and you focused your study on the Southern Creole. Can you give us a brief understanding of that?
Sure. So you had Creole communities that developed in New Orleans and Natchitoches, Acadiana, and over centuries they've spread out. Yeah, they've spread out since then, but Natchitoches was established very, very early on. And then you had New Orleans that was established. So these are French posts. These are French military centers that became trade centers and hubs of culture and people.
Okay, so they didn't migrate on their own there. Those were posts.
They were posts,
okay,
yeah.
But now that makes
military
it
installations. Okay. You had them going up the Mississippi River. You had Fort Deschartres. You had,
got it.
All these things. That's what's sending people out. Because Natchitoches was the border of the Spanish lands. Yeah. So you're trying to establish your dominance in the area. You're claiming the territory, and you do it with military force. So you have a lot of these troops that are coming out here, and the troops are not always paid on time or at all. And honestly, the royalty in Europe didn't really care what was happening in the New World. They're just trying to, beat everyone else to the punch. And the French and English have always hated each other, so that's what was happening. Right. So you got all these guys. They're just having relationships with the women that were available at the time. And some of the relationships were monogamous, and for all intents and purposes, they were real marriages. They just were not recognized legally. So those children were not recognized as legal heirs. And so they would leave property, they would leave things, and these children, in the Creole community in Natchitoches, extremely wealthy. Some of the wealthiest people in American history were right there in Natchitoches, and they were free people of color because these
timber
men...
and agriculture.
Yeah, a lot of sugar cane, a lot of agriculture. Later on, you had cotton that came in. But they're the property owners. They're the plantation owners. Some of them were sent back to Europe for higher education.
And they're
writing operas.
Yeah, I read that, which was, I think, awesome.
Amazing.
It's awesome. And so, what years did they build wealth? Was that late 1700s, or was that like right in the early 1800s when they really started building wealth?
Yeah, I would say, it was before, Louisiana Purchase, they were already very well established.
Really? Okay.
Yes, oh yeah. So probably the later 18th century. After the French and Indian War ended, people had already been here for a generation at that point. New Orleans was established in 1718, so French and Indian War ended. And the Creoles were already established in New Orleans, in Natchitoches, in the metropolitan areas, if you will, loosely termed in the colonial period. But by the time the Acadians arrived as refugees, the Creoles were very well established, and they had made their money.
And you had mentioned just the prairie areas. I meant
Yeah.
that's countryside, right?
Right.
And so
It's the places where the city people weren't.
okay. That's fair enough. So let me ask you this. It seemed that like the Creole got outside of the city, went into the prairies and countryside, and they became the craftsmen. They became the blacksmith, the horsemen, the people who, for example, a plantation owner could contract in to come in to do things. Is that fair?
Yes.
And so not only did they own property and establish their own industry or businesses, they were like today's electrician, plumber, concrete person.
They made the colony run.
They made the colony run, but they were free people.
Yes.
They were free.
Oh, absolutely.
All right. And so here comes the Cajuns tripping along, and the Cajuns sort of cramped their style, it seems like, did they?
Well, I think when the Acadians arrived, the colony was a little bit in turmoil because the Spanish had just taken over the colony.
Which was better, right? Wasn't the Spanish
Spain was
way better?
Spain was really trying to. Spain didn't care about Louisiana, to be honest. Nobody really cared about Louisiana. Most people didn't go because they wanted to be there. They were forced there, like the Acadians, like the Africans. It wasn't like, this is the colony of choice. It was, we're stuck here now. We got to make the best of what we've got. But then when the Spanish took over the colony, they knew that they needed to populate it quickly. And they knew had seen what the French had done, and they realized the French, not good colonizers, they're not going to be able to maintain control of this area. And Spain was looking for a buffer zone. They had the Mississippi River, they had the mouth of the Mississippi, which was the bloodline to the entire continent. So if they can control the Mississippi River, they can control a lot. But also Spain was interested in Texas and beyond, because all that property was to the west was Spanish territory. And they could see that the British were coming and establishing, the colonies along the American colonies as they came to be known. And so Spain was very concerned about protecting their landholdings west, and Louisiana was going to be that stopgap territory for them to prevent the British from moving forward.
The original Louisiana Purchase
Yes.
that ran all the way up,
Yeah.
not just down here.
Right. They considered it Upper and Lower Louisiana. So Upper Louisiana is Illinois, that kind of those territories, and then you had Lower Louisiana, which is what we now consider Louisiana. So Spain was really looking for the buffer zone, and they were trying to populate the colony. So they were trying to recruit from the Canary Islands, which some of my family came over during that period. And they understood that if you want a colony to be successful, you have to have women and children. So let's bring women and children. And they did. And the Acadians had been, exiled in 1755. The first Acadians didn't start arriving here till about 10 years later. But Spain extended the invitation because, first of all, we have families, which is a good thing. We need families here to make this place a go. Secondly, they're at war with the British. There's no love of the British, so we'll have good allies, if push comes to shove. Thirdly, they're Catholic, which happens to be convenient since that's the only religion we will tolerate in the colony, which is ironic because the Acadians, when they left France, they were Huguenots. They were French Protestants fleeing Catholic persecution, which very few people know about. And over time, about 150 years of being in the New World, probably because of Jesuit missionaries, they converted. So they left France fleeing Catholic persecution, but by the time they left Nova Scotia, by the time they left Canada, they were considered Catholic. And so Spain was like, well, that's fine, you can come on in, and kind of put the word out. And whenever the Acadians arrived, they weren't allowed to settle in New Orleans, in the urban areas, because they've got nothing but the clothes on their back, and that's shredded as it is. And they've been in transit for 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
I mean, the Acadians kept coming until 1785. So you got like 30 years, like a whole generation of people who have been essentially homeless and wandering the four corners of the globe trying to find a place to establish themselves. Nobody wants that as their neighbor.
Right.
It's reality. It's human. I mean, no one's excited about a boatload of refugees arriving
Right.
with the inability to speak the language. They're coming from Canada. They don't know how to adapt to the climate in Louisiana yet. They can contribute nothing right now. So Spain gave them, a couple barrels of old clothing, some passe-partout saws. I mean, just a few little odds and ends that they could scrounge up, and said, "Good luck. Here's some land out here in the prairie. Here's some land out here in the swamps," and that's where the Acadians ended up. And that's why when people say, "Oh, I love New Orleans," I love the Cajun food. It's like, no.
No.
They want to claim it now, but
Yeah.
they didn't allow the Acadians to settle there. And the Creoles had money at this point. You had the white Creoles, and you had also black Creoles, mixed Creoles. They had money, and the way they had money was they had the plantations, they had the big property, and then the people that were the free people of color started. Prior to the Civil War, you had a three-tiered society with a triangular. If you can imagine that. And the bottom was the enslaved Africans, of course. Then you had the free people of color in the middle, and then you had the whites on top. Well, that free people of color band was huge. And the Americans that came into the area during, with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, then the War of 1812 later, statehood in 1812, they had no idea what to do with this place. They had never seen that many free blacks walk in the street like they owned it.
So we were different than Mississippi, Alabama, and all the other big slave owner places in that they had a much more rigid system. You had your plantation owner and your slaves, and we growing this, and that's what it's going to be. We was mixing it up a couple hundred years ahead of time. So I'm most proud of that. I'm most proud of call it a free country, territory, call it whatever, but we were, the first experiment of just throwing a lot of different people and cultures together to make it work. And so when you think of the United States as a free country, the whole concept is all these different immigrants coming in to learn to live together. Man, we got a lot of years and lessons learned ahead of the whole operation, and I don't think we get enough credit.
No, we don't. And the reason why is because we weren't colonized by the British. Because the British came over with families. They built forts.
Well,
they kept
everyone class
at arm's
system bullshit, and they wanted.
Well, they kept everyone at arm's length. And the French did not. The French married whoever they wanted to marry or had relations with whoever they wanted to. And, I mean, I joke all the time, but it's true. You're not going to start a war against your father-in-law. Well, it's not advisable anyway. So if you're a French guy and you've got, 3, 4 Indian wives up and down the river that you're trading and trapping with and what have you, well, you're not going to start a war with them. You're going to have peaceful relations because it's a mutually beneficial relationship. But if you come over here with a wife and 3 kids, well, she's not going to take very kindly to you going up and down the river and doing whatever the heck you want. So it's going to be different. And the British, when they colonized, they came over with families and they established communities that, and some places they had good relations with the native people, but not always, most commonly not. But you don't hear about conflicts in Louisiana because they didn't have the wars.
Right.
And other places, they didn't have they had the Natchez Wars in 1729, 1730, but compared to the other conflicts in other areas, it was really nothing in comparison.
Even Hatfield McCoy level, you don't hear a lot of that.
No, it was very different, and especially when I travel, I tell people all the time, South Louisiana is not the Deep South. It is a world unto its own. North Louisiana is the Deep South.
Correct.
It is North Louisiana is South Arkansas. It's Mississippi. It's Alabama. It's South Louisiana. It's because of that heavy, heavy, heavy French
Creole
influence. Yeah. And so people, when we had segregation here, when we had the schools, and you didn't have the riots, you didn't have all the violence because people here were like, well, no big deal. Like, that's your relatives. That's your family. So it was a lot different than you found in other places. And I think it is.
This
it is
is a
remarkable.
question I wanted to ask you. I want to make sure I asked you is how long, if we wouldn't have had the Civil War and freed the slaves, if it never came to war, they came to whatever agree, or even if the South won, how long, in your opinion, would slavery had lasted?
Ooh, I don't.
Because it seemed like it was tracking nicely with the free people of color and the Creole, later Creole. It was just tracking nicely. I mean, from a business standpoint, which is it would have just made more sense for it to go away and the Creoles would have taken over all the old plantations, and I know they had slaves then, but I think eventually I would like to think it would have just eventually went away. I'm glad the war came. I'm glad they needed to knock it out immediately. That was the worst time in our history. But do you think it would have ended on its own? And if so, when?
I don't know, honestly, if it would have ended on its own because you had a lot of the Creoles of color who were wealthy, who were plantation owners, who actually owned slaves. And, there's been a lot of discussion like, well, they purchased them in order to emancipate them. Well, they didn't always emancipate them. Like and it's a horrible thing, but you have to, in this period, I mean, you're dehumanizing humans.
Yeah.
So that's the only way you can justify the institution of slavery is if you dehumanize them and make them partial people, which is what was happening. At the same time, it was business. It was the way the economy ran. So if you didn't have enough property to sustain all of your desires and pleasures, all of your toys and what have you, whether it was more carriages, more, a bigger house, what have you, you were not successful. And because the wealthy plantation owners, whether they were white, black, or mixed, did not want to dirty their hands. They had reached a level of society where they managed property, but they were not working in the fields. They were not, putting horseshoes on it. They weren't doing any of the manual labor, and they wanted it that way. So when the Civil War came in and abolished slavery at the end of the war, now all these wealthy plantation owners, they have nothing. The war has decimated them, and all they have is their property, and they started selling off their property left and right because they did not want to go to work. They were not skilled in trades. They had never worked for a living, per se. Not like it's not work to manage, but the CEO...
Little poetic justice there, right?
Yeah. The CEO probably isn't the guy cleaning the bathrooms in the operation, a multi-million-dollar operation. And that's what these guys were doing. So they're like, ugh. So the only way they could keep their good name and keep their social standing was to sell property.
And that was only going to last so long.
That was only going to last so long. And when the Americans started flooding in after the war, that's why the Americans started coming in and purchasing up all these big, beautiful plantation homes, and they painted them white. And before that they had all these colors. It was a Creole culture, Creole society. And so when we think of, plantation homes, the big white columns on it, like they weren't white at the time. The Americans came in and literally whitewashed those houses.
I learned that today. Thank you.
Oh, cool.
Because I think of it as white, but I should be thinking of it as all kind of different colors.
When you do the excavation, the preservation work, and you go down all the layers,
Wow.
It's colors. Africa is full of colors. The Caribbean is full of colors.
Yes.
New Orleans is full of colors. People here love color. And it was the Americans who came in and it's like, well, we're going to have a beautiful white mansion. We're going to have a beautiful white mansion.
Now you made me mad again.
It's literally whitewashing history, but it is what it is. So if you see a historic home and it's got this garish pink with green or purple trim
That's
or whatever,
original.
that probably, if it's an antebellum home and it's those colors, somebody did their research and that's probably the original color, or as close to it as they can get.
I think that's neat. Okay, so now we're in 1868, 1870. Slavery's ended. Now everybody's on the same playing field. The Boudreaux, the Creoles, the Indians, everybody's broke.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody's broke. All right, the party's over. Now it's rebuilding. So did that enhanced the story of the Creoles because now Cajuns are marrying Creoles and Creoles are marrying American Indians and African Americans. It's starting to loosen up, but the gumbo is just getting thick around the late 1800s.
Actually, I would say more of the opposite started taking place.
Okay, tell me about that.
Because when the Americans started coming in, like we kind of referenced earlier, they freaked out. They had never seen so many free people of color. They had never seen so much what they considered arrogance walking down the streets. These free women of color, like, wearing silk dresses and pearls and acting like they owned the street. Well, they owned the street. Rampart Street was theirs. They had all had their own property, their own houses. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, they owned the streets. And Americans were shocked by that because every person of color was enslaved in their world. They didn't know what to do with it. And of course, the French and the English historically
Yeah.
and today, you can watch a BBC film and they're always going to throw a jab at the French in it because that's just what they do. But when the Americans started coming in, they had money, more than what was decimated after the Civil War, what was left of it. And so to marry money, a lot of the wealthier or formerly wealthy Creoles, and I mean white Creoles as well, wanted to marry up. They needed money. They wanted to marry money. So they overlooked the cultural and linguistic and religious differences between the Americans and the Creoles, and they married their daughters into American families, and so those marriages were taking place. But at the same time, in order to make those relationships with American money and American society work, they had to distance themselves from any African connections because the Americans didn't like it. So for white Creoles who may have had another, a second family somewhere, with Creoles of color, what have you, they started distancing themselves. And then you've got the Jim Crow era that's coming in, and segregation. And it was, it was bad enough that you were poor, but you didn't want to be African or Indian as well. And so families, black Creoles especially, who could pass, a lot of them passed for white because they had been so mixed for so long. They were well-cultured, wealthy people. So now you've got Creoles, formerly the free people of color population, really a lot of them resented the Civil War because what happened was it freed the slaves. And the Americans and other people coming in saw any person of color as a former slave. Well, as we definitely know, that was not the case. These people were wealthy. They ran the colony. Mm-hmm. And now they're being socially categorized, like the enslaved population, those field hands.
Why didn't the free people of color, or the Creoles, which they went from free people of color to using the word Creole after the Civil War?
They dropped the color, yeah.
They dropped the color.
And white Creoles.
Why did they feel like they had to marry up? There wasn't any way for them just to sort of regroup and continue their model on?
And no, it was really tough because during the colonial period, with the marriages, you couldn't marry free and enslaved. So if you had, you could only marry free between free. Well, there were a lot more free women than there were free men in the colony, because the man would have, a relationship or mistress free her.
But whose laws, though? I mean, the constitutional law didn't come and protect that then?
No. The Code Noir, the black codes.
It was still under the Code Noir.
Yeah.
God damn.
So at one point in the history, there was, let's say I'm a free woman of color. Mm-hmm. As a free woman of color, I cannot legally marry a white man. Mm-hmm. I cannot legally marry a black man if he's enslaved. But there's a whole lot more free women of color because they're all mistresses or concubines or what have you than there are. You're not going to free your workforce, right? You might free the pretty girl. And that's what was happening. And so there's a lot more free women. So their only option was to marry another free man of color, which that ratio was 70 to 1. 70 free women to 1 free man. So she really didn't have a lot of options to get married. And so that's why plaçage, or the system of placing, or the left-handed marriages started taking place, where she was placed with a white man who could afford her a life of, ease and
That's
luxury.
where the quadroon balls.
Exactly, the
Okay.
octoroons and all that. So the descendants of these people, after several generations, they have grown up, in a sense, with a silver spoon in their mouth compared to the field hands that are out there, the darker skinned, the labor force, what have you. And so whenever the slaves are freed, the girls, the men that could pass for white, that had property, that had owned, some of them owned slaves, whatever, they were trying to, keep money in the family and keep their social status. And so they started denying relatives that were darker than them or not as wealthy as them or what have you. To this day, I know Creoles who do not acknowledge each other in public, within the Black Creole community, because some are darker skinned and some are lighter skinned. Or it just kind of depends on what side of the fence you are. And that's happening even today. It's very quiet and it's within the Creole community. So it's not so much of a Cajun versus Creole thing. It's a lot of Creole within the Creole community because of just generations of thinking a certain way. Like if I do this, then I'll get to the top of the ladder. Or
So does it fall under survival, fake it till you make it, do what you got to do, tent? Is it a lot of that?
absolutely, absolutely. If you want to have a job in society, if you want to get maintain or acquire a certain level of social status, you're going to have to make sacrifices. You're going to have to make decisions.
I guess what's so frustrating to me is, who sets this? Why haven't we grown up or evolved more from a social status where that even matters? I mean, are we getting closer to that? Because, who really cares or should care? I mean, I can see maybe back in the day, when, they didn't have an elaborate economic capitalist system, and you're just trying to hold on to money and property, and you do it by marriage and holding it together. And, I guess that I wasn't living there at that time. But this day and age, especially the last 50 years, it just seems that a lot of that should have loosened up a lot. Where do you think we are with that?
I think a lot has changed, and I think a lot has changed for the better. I see a lot of people, and within the Creole community too, embracing each other. And I mean, there used to be, you could go to a dance, and I don't know if you've heard about these or not, but the paper bag test. Where if you were
That
darker,
was Jim Crow, right? I think Jim Crow was paper bag test.
yeah,
If you're darker than a paper bag.
or lighter, depending on which dance you were going to, because they didn't want you to mix. They didn't want the lighter skin mixing with the dark skin and that sort of thing. So it was all about perception.
What a huge missed opportunity,
Talk about. I mean, Louisiana had the one drop rule.
Look,
you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black, so it could be harder for you to get a job.
You know what? They missed the party. I'm here to tell you. They missed the big party because, where I grew up, my dad was a sugarcane farmer, and I was all around black farmers and helpers, and I went to school with a lot of Creoles, and man, white people can't dance like that.
No, they can't.
I mean, but to me.
But it's even more than that. Like my dad grew up in Crowley, and he was throwing hay when he was, a teenager, and he's working in the field with black guys his whole life, and rice farming, whatever. And he gets into the military. He's, enlisted during the Vietnam War, and they're trying to give them, training, diversity training and stuff. And he's like, who needs this, man? We get along. I've never had any problems with a black guy in my life. When they had when Clifton Chenier was playing the very first festival, when it was at the Blackham Coliseum, and there were events where my dad would go, and he was the only white guy in the club, and he never had a lick of trouble. It was So in the world that he grew up in, it did not matter, and it was fine. Although he also grew up in the world where they had separate water fountains. So there were separate water fountains, but he was in the field working with these guys all day, and he gets into the military. He's like, the military had relatively recently desegregated, because it was still segregated during World War II, and he was like, who needs this training? Who are these people? And he realized, oh, they've never actually interacted with each other before, not the world I grew up in. When I moved to Arkansas for my PhD a few years ago, I was blown away. I had never lived in an area where racism was so clear cut. I mean, it shocked me because I did not grow up in that world. I did not grow up with they and them and us and them. And I mean, I didn't grow up in that world. And to see it, how it just exists as if it was normal and people weren't even intentionally trying to be offensive. It was just, it is the way things are. And I remember we were talking to a couple guys. There's an old guy, and he had a driver with him. It was a black guy. And that black man was an old man, never lifted his head and never made eye contact with anybody. We were all having a conversation, standing in the middle of a cotton field. He never looked, everything was yes sir, no sir, kept his head down. And I left, and I was just like, I had tears in my eyes. I had never seen that. I had never experienced that in my life. That doesn't happen here and the way it happens in other places. And it blew my mind.
Well, it's there. And whether it's not for us to say or do, it's for them to coach us and tell us, and what a missed opportunity. But I'm with you. I'm a lot more optimistic. I know there's a lot of a long ways to go with it, but I'm so proud of our heritage here, and the Creole story is just so wonderful and thick, and my mind just plays around. I think I want to ask you this too. I think it was really, I would imagine it was very local too. Like, in other words, what's going on in Brew Bridge, Louisiana might be different than Franklin or Lafourche or Lafayette or anywhere. I bet it was very local because you were making it work in your own little world. So
you didn't have the luxury of mobility.
Yeah.
You were on a plantation, and there was a reason why you were not allowed to move or travel without express written permission. There was a reason for that, and that carried over into sharecropping. You were not allowed. You didn't have the ability to literally move, and so whenever you take away people's mobility, they're stuck in a situation. So, there was a reason for that. It was very well thought out reason. They didn't want people moving and doing things and being independent, and that definitely carried over for a while. There's one of the gentlemen that I interviewed talked about how he was the first in his family. He's a black man. He's Creole. He was the first to get a vehicle, and he said, we grew up walking to church. We grew up riding a wagon to church, and he said, family was sharecroppers, and the big man didn't want us moving because if we moved, we'd see a life outside of where we were. And he didn't want that to happen because he wanted us to stay put and stay exactly where we were. He said, and I got a vehicle, and he said, man, it's like there is another world out here. And it's a world that I like to be a part of. I don't want to stay picking cotton for this man the rest of my life. And so, that lack of mobility,
Oh yeah.
that was there for a reason.
What we're trying to do here at the cafe is to celebrate culture and share knowledge that will enrich us all. That's our purpose statement. And so I'm of the mindset that, let's quit spending so much time and energy on trying to make this big, beautiful blend. I say celebrate each individual culture and just appreciate it as it is, and everybody's, just appreciate each other. What's their whole makeup. all the beauty in it, not trying to make one another or whatever. And then what a wonderful place to live if we can pull that off. So I'm hoping my children see. It seems like they are a lot more level playing field, and I'm hoping all of those uh, ways of the past drift away fast. But we have to. I talked to Dr. Crocco here a week or two, Frank. We was talking about that as well. It starts with the truth about history, and you did a great job, and we all should appreciate what you did in the book. Is it's important that we gather the truthful history, even by different perspectives, but for sure the perspective uh, of the Creoles and African Americans and the Native Americans, and and try to right any of those wrongs in history because it's only right, and let's don't whitewash anything, and we should all be anxious to get the truth out because I think when that
Yeah.
happens, man, you just discover all kind of great things. Not so great things, but it
Well,
starts with the truth.
it has to be true and it has to be authentic. It has to be real. And I tell people all the time, I'm a historian. It is my job to interpret the past as it was,
Yeah.
not as how I wish it would have been.
Yes.
If I could have changed things in history, there's no end to the things I would have changed in history. That's not my job. That I can't do that. It is what it is. There was a time and a place where things were accepted and not accepted, and things were okay and not okay, and it was a different world. And I can't presume to be more than what they were in their time. That's it is what it is. There will be generations ahead, in the future who will look at us and say, "I can't believe they thought this was okay," and they will, try to right our wrongs. And good for them. That's history. That's the nature of humanity and society. But I think it is important to, I can't right the wrongs of history. It is what it is. But I can make my world a better place.
Yeah.
And that's what I tell people all the time. The impact that I can have on people's lives and the interactions that I have with people and my sphere of influence matters. And those ripples can drift out. So I can't control who came before me. I can't brag or be ashamed of my ancestry because I had zero to do with it. I am in this time and place for this reason, and that's it. All I can do is try to affect the future
Yes.
for future generations. So I don't carry a burden of the past, although history is very burdensome. And there's been a couple of times where I actually had to realize what my own personal limitations are in the research because I taught in Africa, and I have, when I was doing a lot of the slave research, I mean, you're looking at the names of Africans coming over on the ships. These were people, these were humans with lives and stories and families and talents and skills and idiot moves. And I mean, they're people. And when I was looking at the names of some of the lists, it's the same names of some of the students I was teaching. And for me, it was so heavy and it was so hard for me to get through that research because I had faces and names and I had people that I saw on those lists. And it was very heavy work. And at the same time, like I said, I did not do that. That is not my burden to bear. My burden to bear is to make sure that slavery as it exists today is stopped. Sex trafficking, things like that. Like that is our topic, and not enough people talk about things like that are happening in our world. Because I think a lot of times it's easier to distance ourselves from what's happening now and look about things we wish we could have changed, and sometimes we miss what's happening in our time because it's just not people weren't talking about how horrible slavery is in 1755. It was like, hey, this is the way to go. This is the way we can make a life. We can make a lot of money. We can make a colony. It wasn't considered bad, although it's horrible. And so I think for every generation, we just have to keep striving to do better.
Yeah.
We have to do
Hey,
better.
we're only on this little ball of dirt for a little while,
That's
so
it.
they're going to be studying us, and I don't want them studying us, studying what went on back then. But, my final note before we move on to cuisine is we're indebted to the African American community. I mean, we the history books talk about slavery a lot, and they get very little appreciation of they were the ones who built and established the original colonies. And if we didn't have them, where would this country be? It sure wouldn't have been here as fast. It wouldn't have built the wealth. If we don't have wealth, we can't fight off war, have wars to fight off people, the English and everybody else trying to come in. Um, we are on the shoulders of a lot of the African Americans, and they don't get near the respect and appreciation for it. And I know they were here as slaves. It was terrible, but they did the work. They built this country. As ugly as it was, this country is indebted to them. So I hope that, I sure hope that people start to appreciate that a little more. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I wish that people would see them as people and not as slaves and not as dehumanized, workers, but as actual people with lives and families and likes and dislikes and everything. They were totally human and people. And
Oh my God.
when you just make them a number, it takes away
Yeah.
their manhood. It takes away their femininity. It takes away their identity of who they are. It takes away their languages. It strips them of everything that is common and decent and good, and it just makes them a statistic. And I've really,
From a historical standpoint.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
So you
no.
talk about World War II, 6 million Jews. That doesn't mean anything. It's a big number. We can't comprehend it. But when you talk about one person's life and one
Yeah.
person's story, it humanizes that whole horrible
Yeah.
experience.
Well, I brought this book out here. One of my favorite chefs of all time, John Foss. Have you ever seen the Bible?
Yes.
Okay, so anybody's ever seen this, check it out. But he goes, that's one of the best, I'd say the best cookbook ever made, because the beginning of it talks about the Cajun and Creole history of cooking and everybody who contributed to it. And part of Dr. Issa's book is a huge part of our world is cooking and music. But from a cooking standpoint, I know I have my views, but I'll let you go since you're the guest. How would you describe the evolution of Creole cooking, and how do you describe it to people who are outside of Louisiana and ask you those questions when it comes to food? Because I know you like me. You love some food. That's the best. It's the
When
best.
I've lived in exile, that was the thing I missed the most. I think I could play the music, but I couldn't find the food anywhere.
Right.
I had to make it myself. Oh man, the food, just like the language, it evolved with the blending of cultures and out of necessity. They discovered that wheat does not grow in Louisiana. So you couldn't make your French bread, and you couldn't have your delicacies and all your pastries and things like that you might have been accustomed to in Europe. And you had to eat corn, which was shameful. And that was animal fodder. The slaves ate corn, but that's because they were considered subhuman. You did not eat corn. Now, you put me on an island, if I have cornbread and sweet potatoes, I will survive. So, we love corn. Corn makshu, cornbread, couscous. You name it. Like, we eat corn, but that was horrible at the beginning. Nobody ate corn unless you were literally starving and had no other option. So sometimes the best things came out of absolute necessity. You would die because you can't grow wheat in this environment. And rice was not a thing in Europe. Rice was a thing in Africa. And they brought over barrels of rice with Africans who knew how to cultivate it. And, rice, well, we got enough water around here. We can make rice work. ranching. I mean, we eat a lot of smoked meats and things like that, but horse culture and ranching, the cowboys were black. They came over from Africa, and they, I mean, they were called cowboys because it was a derogatory term. You don't call a man a boy. But they called them cowboys because they worked the cattle. And there's a lot of things. So this whole, the black cowboy culture within the Creole community, people are just
That's not a fad.
no, it's been there since Africa. It's been
Right.
around for a long time. You don't catch that in Hollywood, so the perception is
Right.
the cowboys were white, but goodness gracious, that those movies were made during segregation too. That's not the history. And so there's a lot of things that have gone unnoticed, undetected, underappreciated, but yeah, cooking well. I mean,
Well, I can only see through my eyes of my little life. My grandmother was a bara, and that's actually Paul Bara right there behind you. He made the quarter drain. You see that patent for him right here?
okay,
The
yeah.
patent
Yeah.
quarter drain. So, uh, and he couldn't read or write in English,
Yeah.
but he sure knew how to cook, and he was a very accomplished inventor, smart as could be. Um, but his cooking, he taught his daughter, my grandmother. And I remember in the '80s when Paul Prudhomme and everybody was blowing up, and I'm like, hey, why don't you make all? So they were just, and she made it clear. She said, listen, I don't know what those people are doing. They're getting too cute with all this stuff. But she said, you need salt, you need pepper, and you need cayenne. That's it.
That's it.
You want your food to taste like the food. You just need to learn how to cook it, how long, and all those things. And I think of that um, with the Creole community as well. And also, what I think is like she married a Arkansas little redneck who came down and
Sorry
he
for all the
went where-
Arkansas
That's
comments.
actually that's him right there. Yeah, poor Arkansas, we're destroying him right now. But he was a big.
We'll play
Call-
him in football.
Right.
It'll be fine.
Right. Well, he liked certain things like chicken fried steak
Sure.
or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever.
White
So
gravy, biscuits
yeah,
and gravy.
so
yeah.
she did it, but she Cajuned it up.
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of that moving around, and
It happened with the oil field too, because a lot of Cajun women married Texas men, and guess
Good
what?
point.
Those kids spoke French at home. Those kids ate and grew up Cajun, and those guys just had to adapt, which is not a hard stretch because the food's good. So
Yeah.
if it wasn't good, it wouldn't be so adaptable. But a lot of time, I mean, we talk about the oil field as a second exile for all the Acadian men because they all went offshore. They went out. And then, you've got all this blending and mixing of cultures again. It's going to happen out of necessity. You lose your male population, well,
Yeah.
something's going to fill the vacuum. So, but I think the Creole cuisine it's two different things again. It's just like, the way historically Creole was defined differently. In the urban areas, like in New Orleans, Creole is haute cuisine. It's fancy. It's it's fine dining. It's courses and sauces, and it's very French, actually.
yeah, I think
It's very,
so.
very French, and it's wealthy. It's money.
But the Prairie Creoles,
Creoles in Acadiana are eating and preparing food the exact same way the Cajuns are. You don't put tomatoes in jambalaya. You don't put a sauce on your eggs Benedict in the morning. Like, you're eating couscous, you're eating
Right.
grits, you're eating greens and
Right.
cornbread and, beans and rice and things like that. So that's why when people talk about, oh, the Creole food is just so delicious, like, well, you must be talking about New Orleans because the Creole food and Cajun food
yeah,
out here, what's the difference?
yeah.
Yes, there's not a huge difference at all.
What I love is like my grandmother had 13 kids, right? And she Essie was her name. She came and helped my grandmother my whole life. I love her. She was my second grandmother. And she was like, you just always cook what's in the kitchen, basically what's available.
Yep.
So if you had potatoes that end season, if they were sweet potatoes or red potatoes, or somebody brought some fish by, somebody slaughtered a calf, somebody smoked some meat, whatever, that's what you were cooking.
Exactly.
And they had these magic pots with all these people, but they can stretch things, but it was just so, it just went together so perfect.
Those black pots are seasoned very well.
Very well.
And nothing tastes quite like them.
So, what would you suggest to a listener who's coming around here to really get the authentic feel for Creole food? How would they? Is it sort of a scavenger hunt, or do you just dive into a little town and go to the deal? Because the whole tourist trap thing kind
Go to
of,
the plate lunch places.
yeah,
Go to the house that's got a painted menu on the wall.
right.
Find those places.
There you go.
That's where the best food. If you're not going to go into someone's home, because home cooking is hard to beat. But the plate lunch places, I mean, that's where you'll find everything that people are cooking at home. But because of lives and lifestyles, they may not have time to sit there and cook beans and rice all day because she's a nurse or what have you. That's the places where you go and you find those little mom and pop shops that they're not going to be a chain. They should never be a chain. But they're cooking because that's how they grew up cooking, and they're cooking in a big pot because that's how they fed the family. So they've got their proportions and their seasonings down pat. And if they're not successful, we are very, very picky eaters. If they're not good, we won't support them, and they will shut down. So if they've been around for a while, that's a safe place to go.
No,
it may not look like it passed the Board of Health inspection,
Right.
but it's a good place to eat.
Right. No, that's good. That's good advice. And just to find just local people who know how to cook that way. A lot of my best friends are that way. Do you cook?
I do cook.
Good.
Yeah.
And how would you define your cooking? More Cajun, more Creole, a mix?
I don't know. Like I said, I really don't see a huge difference between Cajun and Creole in this area. I mean, I could say Cajun just because more people know what it is outside of this area. Not so many people know what Creole is. But, I mean, red beans and rice, cornbread,
My dad
things
always-
like gumbo. That's a universal thing in this area.
And my dad always said that. He said, you're more of a Creole cook than a Cajun cook. I don't even know what a Cajun cook is, because by that time they were getting fancy and
Yeah,
I think
gourmet.
yeah.
No, the only time I've ever had anything black is when somebody cooked it too long and it was burnt.
Oh, I know.
Like that's
Terrible.
not.
Terrible.
Those are the types of things that made it international cuisine and what. That's not Cajun food. If it's black, you burnt it. It's a
Are
problem.
you a gumbo snob?
I'm not a snob, but I like a good gumbo.
Right.
Yeah. I will
That's
not
the
eat gumbo.
hardest thing
I
for
will
me
not
to
eat
do.
gumbo outside of this area. I will tell you that.
Look,
so
me-
maybe I am a snob.
I try to use my manners. You know what I'm saying? But I can tell immediately if it's going to be a good gumbo or not. So, So,
I read a whole book about gumbo, a children's book.
You did. You're going to talk about that in a second.
So maybe I am a snob and I just don't realize it.
Maybe so. So during your research and all your time, I know you did a lot of field work. I know you get in the middle of it. Did you gain a lot of friendships?
Oh, absolutely.
And what are your thoughts on that? What is your perspective in life and our community pre your book and post? What did you learn?
Well, I think one of the interesting things for me was when I said I wanted to, I went and got a PhD so I would have the time to write the book.
Okay.
Because I knew that if I went and got a PhD, I would do the research and I would dedicate that time. Otherwise, life is so busy and what have you. So I went into the PhD program knowing this is what I wanted to do. I didn't know how I wanted to frame it exactly, but I knew I had a good idea of what I wanted to do. My master's thesis was on Cajun stereotypes and the development of cultural tourism.
Mm-hmm.
So I had looked at the Cajun communities and looked at, you know, how people self-identify, how we are self-deprecating humor, all these things, and all the stereotypes of, you know, what a good Cajun and authentic Cajun is, and how that has played into the tourism industry. But at the time, like, Creole wasn't even a tagline, so, and the Creoles were here before the Cajuns, so how do you explain that? So when I went for a PhD, I knew I wanted to focus on Creole. And I was told by multiple people from here in academia that that'll never happen. I said, well, what do you mean that'll never happen? Well, nobody's going to talk to you. I said, what do you mean nobody's going to talk to me? Creoles are not going to talk to you. I said, why not? Well, I tried, and they wouldn't talk to me. And I thought, well, maybe you're a jerk. I don't know. I never had any problems talking to anybody in my life. I don't know. But so it kind of made me wonder, like, well, I don't know. We'll see how it goes. And I can honestly say that I never had a door closed to me, ever. I see you at the dance halls. I run into you at the grocery store. Like, you know me. I grew up here. I'm not coming in from outside. I'm not here to, get rich off of your oral tradition or whatever. Like, you are my people. Let's tell our own stories and let's do it right for a change. So I asked somebody, hey, can I come over and talk to you? Yeah, babe, no problem. I'll be at the house around 3 o'clock. And I was always there on time. unlike yesterday. But, and the thing is, like, even if I didn't know them that well, they knew me from somebody else. And so sometimes the first question was, where are you from? I'm from Lafayette. Oh, all right. Yeah, babe. They'd sit back in their seat and we'd talk for hours. And a lot of times, because it's, research, whatever, I'd record it. But I'd turn the recorder on and never look at it again. Because I really didn't care about the recording. I cared about the person and the relationship. And so we just had conversations, and I would go back to visit them. A lot of times it's older people. They just want to visit and chat. I'm like, well, you're going to stay for supper, right? I mean, I eat supper with everybody. And, I never had any problems. And I know that they didn't hold back. Because that's how I got the stories I got. I didn't grow up in a world that they grew up in. I'm talking to 70, 80-year-old Creoles. And this was 15, 20 years ago I started doing this research. So, they were honest with me because they trusted me. And they knew I wasn't going anywhere.
So the Creoles, to me, look like they're the happiest people in the world. I mean, when they were sharing their feelings, how would you describe it? Is there still some resentment there? Is there still some aggravation there? Is there still some prejudice there?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Is it getting better? I mean, is it...
I think it's getting a lot better, honestly. I mean, you don't have segregated dance halls anymore. I mean, we're talking black, white, every shade of every
So when
every
they talk
person,
about the
it's very
bad
different.
times, we're 40, 50 years ago, or is it still happening right now in their world?
No, I've had some experiences, personal experiences, and I'm not that old, where, at a festival and somebody's like, they're taking our shade. It's like, I'm sorry, what? Like, there's a couple of black people standing under, and I happen to know the guys because I danced with them. And it's like this white guy, I guess he thought he would have an ally or something. I don't know, but he was just like, they're taking our shade. It's like, excuse me, whose shade is this? We're under a tree in a park, in a public place. Like, what the heck? And, had no idea who we were and had no idea my thoughts on anything, just made an assumption.
Thought it was okay to
it's
say
like,
that.
Actually, I know those guys. They're very sweet, older Creole men, and pressed jeans, boots. I mean, like the very, very traditional Creole guy at a dance hall or a festival. And so, so I've had my own experiences to back up my research, if you will, because I am from this community and I live here, and these are my people too. And so I think that made a big difference in them opening up and talking about things that were very painful. I had a girl who's probably half my age that shared with me. She's darker skinned Creole, and she was not allowed in her grandmother's house when she was, all the cousins were what have you. The lighter skinned cousins were allowed to play in the house. The darker skinned cousins had to play outside. This was a Creole grandmother doing that to her own grandchildren. And this girl's younger than me, significantly. So people don't tell you those stories unless they really trust you, because that is traumatic, that is painful, and that is just mind-blowing that those things still happen today. At the same time, I see great strides and great progress, and I can go to any dance hall anywhere. I've never had a problem. Mixed crowds, all black crowds. Like, and I don't know if everybody knows me, but
You know,
it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, it's the energy that you bring, and everybody should be allowed to bring that positive energy and just. So, how many is the French speakers? Is that going away pretty quick?
No, I think we're actually gaining French speakers. If you mean
Like inside the community, they'll
French.
speak French.
You mean specifically within the Creole community, or just in Louisiana?
Well, like for example, going back to my grandmother, she spoke pure French with her father, and she was cut off. The schools punished them if they spoke
Right,
French.
right.
How terrible was that?
A lot of the black Creoles couldn't even go to school, so that didn't happen to them.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So that's a
But
little
then
different
here's
twist.
my mama can't speak. She speaks probably 50 words. I know probably most of those 50 words in Cajun French.
Mm-hmm.
So one generation blew it up. So in the Creole community, is the younger generation want to learn French, or they getting enculturated into the regular flow of everybody?
Some do. Some want to learn Creole, and there's been, and especially in very recent years, a huge push to speak Creole, not to speak Cajun French, not to speak colonial French, not to speak international French, but to actually speak Creole. And the problem is you can't go to a classroom and learn Creole or Cajun French because it's an oral tradition, and the grammar books don't teach Creole French, unless you go to Haiti or what have you. And so a lot of the dictionaries that are used in Louisiana are from Haiti, because the Haitian Creole is similar to Louisiana. But there are definitely some younger musicians, some younger people who are taking that mantle and going with it and running with it. In Zydeco music, almost all the lyrics are in English, because that generation grew up speaking English.
But is that okay? Why are we trying so hard to... Like, I was speaking to a buddy of mine, Panad. He's with the Laotian community. I don't know if you know Panad. He's phenomenal. I had him on the podcast. He was talking about, they came here in the 80s, 1980s.
Yeah.
Okay. And a generation and a half later, he's saying that the young kids aren't interested in learning Laotian.
Right.
They've been enculturated to here, and they're perfectly fine. They love their tradition. They're very proud of it, but
the language isn't practical.
Thank you. It's not practical.
Right.
So
you're not going to get a job because of it.
Right. So us, the hopeless romantics out there that want everybody to speak Cajun French, and everybody, I remember I wanted to learn Cajun French, but is it practical? That's the question.
I think speaking any language is always an asset. Additional languages is an asset. If you travel, you do business. I love to talk, and I love people, and I like to talk to people. So the more languages I can speak and the more ways I can communicate, the happier I am. So I like languages, and I've studied many of them. That's not for everyone. Not everyone's brain works that way. And I'm not a purist in the sense that everyone must speak. I did not grow up speaking French. My grandfather was a translator during World War II, came home, and didn't teach his sons, 6 boys, a word of
All
English.
right, so me and you the same boat.
Yeah.
They left us out.
They refused to speak English because they said, you're an American, speak English, and I don't want you to have an accent. Which, they have an accent, but it is what it is. So I didn't grow up speaking French. And I studied French. I actually studied Spanish first, and I'm fluent in Spanish. And then I learned French a little bit later. But it wasn't until I was in college that I even knew my grandmother, who I am named after, spoke French because she never spoke French in front of us. And I actually overheard her on the phone talking to her sister
In French?
in French. And I was like, Grandma, when did you learn how
What's
to
up?
speak French? She looked at me and she said, well, and then she got really embarrassed and really awkward. And she said, well, I don't speak the good French. I said, Grandma, it's your first language. How can it not be good? She said, well, I mean, I had it, blah, blah, blah. She was so
why
embarrassed.
was that? Why were they taught that it's bad?
Stigma, because she went to school and it was a shame. Now, she was bilingual when she was a child. She actually helped translate for some of the other 5 and 6-year-olds in her class. And her dad would come home and read books in French. He was literate in French, which is not super common at that time, but it was just so much shame. You didn't want to get caught speaking French, in a public place. You got punished for it, for one. Secondly, you weren't going to get a job because of it. And thirdly, you didn't want to have an accent. So you were trying to get rid of all those things.
Erase who you are.
In one generation. And it worked for a lot of people.
Well,
In a
I'll
lot
tell
of
you
places.
what, that's who we need to find, is who made those rules and laws, and that's so frustrating.
Louisiana, the national, they made school compulsory, and in schools only English was allowed. So it happened to German students, it happened to American Indian students, it happened to anybody who didn't speak English as their first language. Here it affected us because of the massive French population.
So somebody said, okay, if we're going to be one nation, we got to pick a language and everybody has to speak it. To me,
The global language now is English. Technology, I mean, it's English all over the world.
well, perhaps AI is going to help us change that back.
But I don't
Plus
think...
translating for us.
Yeah, there you
and
go.
then we'll be able to learn it.
I don't think that cultures do not survive in a petri dish. And if you put it under a microscope and you say this is authentic and then you limit it to that, it will die.
I agree.
And so, people get all up at arms about, the music and blah, 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 and they're putting hip-hop sounds and Zydeco and this is not Creole music. And people, it's like...
Says who?
Who made the rules?
Right.
If you listen to Cajun music today and you don't hear 1940s, 1950s American swing and pop music and all that influence in there, the things that are like traditional pure Cajun music, you can't hear all that country influence in there. It evolves, and it every generation makes it their own. And if they don't make it their own, it's going to die, because who wants to listen to 18th century
100%.
mazurkas all the time? Like, it's not going to happen. So I'd say let it breathe, let it grow.
Me and you are on the exact same page.
Well, that makes it real easy. Because not everyone agrees. Some people are like, no, it has to be this. It's like, why do you have to sound like the recording from 100 years ago? Why can't you make it your own music? And I love that so many young musicians take it, they honor the tradition, but they make it their own. And that's how, the same thing with the language. You honor the tradition. My grandparents spoke French as their first language. I honor that tradition. But I have to speak what works in my world.
Yeah.
And in my world, I'm speaking exactly, I sound like I'm from Lafayette.
Right.
I sound like I am me. And I get accused all the time, you don't sound like a Cajun. I'm not sure what you want me to sound like. I'm not Swamp People.
Right.
I'm not, that's them.
That's
That's
them.
not me.
I can bring you over there.
Right.
I lived in Pierrepont for a little
Okay.
I did. For 2 years.
But I think everyone has to be their authentic self.
Agree.
This is my authentic self. I don't put on a Cajun accent when I'm giving a talk to sound more authentic to appease an audience. I am who I am.
Well, and again, that's it's easy for two white people to sit up here and talk about that, and there is a level of uncomfortable. But you did this huge study and wrote this wonderful book on it, and I do have plenty of Creole and African American and Latinos. I'll have a bunch of guests lined up to come on here and coach me up on what's happening. So what would you say to all of your Creole family members here, in community members, and who you are today and what you learned from them? What do you give thanks to?
Anytime, and most of my life and career, I've talked with older people. So I have listened to so many stories from so many people, from so many walks of life, and I've learned from each and every one of them. Survival, resilience, patience, kindness. I mean, there's just so much life lessons. I know when we were doing the documentary film First Cousins, which is Cajun and Creole music in South Louisiana, we did a historical overview, and it was interesting because, we interviewed a couple of, known historians, folklorists, myself included, and they, one of the critiques was, well, you didn't get any Creole historians. I said, you didn't hear him? Like, well, I said, well, no, I'm sorry, he doesn't have letters behind his name. That man is a Creole historian. And when we went to interview this particular individual, we were talking to him about music because it's a documentary about music, but he kept wanting to talk about the history and the history and the history. We just let the camera roll. It's like, well, this wasn't the list of questions that, we were planning on talking about or whatever. Let him talk. And then when we got into the editing room and started putting everything together, it's like, this man told the whole history, the whole story, so eloquently. Yeah. And didn't go to school, can't read or write.
Perfect.
Can't sign a check hardly when he gets paid for playing music. And I said, you're missing the point. That is a Creole historian. You don't have to have the letters behind your name. And I think, working with people like that and interacting with people like that, I've learned to respect the people, not the titles. Respect the character and not the caricature of what someone wants to be or not be. And when I did this book, one of the things with the press was, they wanted to do like an academic book, maybe do a black and white photo insert in the middle and then the rest of it, I said, no, absolutely not. And they said, well, it's more expensive. I said, doesn't matter. I want full color images throughout and I want glossy pages. I want it to be really accessible. And they're like, well, it's, we went back and forth on it. I said, let me tell you something. So first of all, this is what we agreed. It's my book. And this is why. I said, you don't understand. A lot of the Creoles that I interviewed for this book that are named and not named, because some of them wanted to be anonymous, I said, a lot of them did not have the opportunity to go to school and get an education. They will never read this book. They have to see their story in the pictures.
Thank you for that.
And I put up a fight, and when they finally got that concept, they said, okay, you win. I said, thank you. Because when I hand this book to so-and-so, I want him to know that he is represented in this story in the most authentic way possible, even though I know that he will never read the words. And that was something that really mattered to me a lot. And I give a lot of talks. I've done a lot of academic conferences, history conferences, what have you. And I've had several times where my name is so unusual, they just assume I've got to be some, probably Creole, African, I'm something. And I walk into a room and I'm, blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair skin. They're like, what? And so I had this, I'll never forget this. I was at a museum conference, and there's this young black girl, like college age. I say young, but she was college age. And she was mad dogging me. She arms folded. She was just like glaring at me. And I started talking, and I'm giving my talk about Creoles and everything. And if you know me, you know that I don't shy from the truth. It may be hard to hear, but I will tell it just straight. Not emotional about it. I'm not trying to over dramatize anything. It's just it is what it is. And I could kind of see her melting a little bit as the session went on, but I just kept talking. I was like, whatever. As soon as I finished my talk, she stood up, and I thought, here we go.
Here we go.
Bring it. So she said, I want to tell you something. And she was from New Orleans. And she said, when I came in here and I saw you standing there, I thought, I'm taking my earrings out. We are going to throw down in the hallway. How dare that white girl get up there and talk about my people? She said, but I have learned something on today. You spoke the truth, and you spoke it exactly the way it is, and you didn't pussyfoot around anything. You didn't sugarcoat anything. She said, and I know that I have more respect for you than I could have ever imagined. And I want you to know, and I want all these people around me to know, because my friend here, she heard me say I want to take my earrings out and fight her in the hallway. I want y'all to know that if she ever has a job opening, I want to work for you because you are real. I said, that's the highest compliment I could have ever gotten.
Absolutely.
She stood up in front of that whole conference and threw her ghetto self right there and said, you know what, I was wrong. And everything you said was right. Those moments are not easy when they start, because you've got to overcome a lot to have someone actually hear what you're saying. But when it comes full circle and that's the response you get, I said, well, thank you for not trying to fight me in the hall, because you would definitely win and I will be pulverized. This will not end well for me. But she came and found me later, a couple of days later in the conference, and she said, I just want to tell you thank you again. You don't understand what you've done to my life. I really appreciate you and I really respect you. And that, can't ask for more than that.
Hey, look,
as far as validation.
Hey, good for her. And I know I thank you. And I think it's just important to tell the truth and be a great storyteller, a great author, and a great human being. And I love that you're here in Acadiana and telling the story, and not that they need me or you or anybody to tell the story, our fellow Creole community members or African Americans or Laotians or whoever. But we sure want to know it, and we want to help correct the truth in whatever we can do. What else you got going? You're a busy lady. I want you to know that. Okay, so I'm not asking to get into the whole military thing, but just kind of fast forward since the book and all. I know you were over a museum. You wrote a book. Just catch us up.
Okay, so I started my own business. Actually, I was on permanent travel with the Army for a few years, working as a museum, working with the Center for Military History to preserve the Army's material culture. So, and the military is its own culture. I love culture. I love people.
I know it.
I loved my time working with those crazy troops. It was just a blast. Still in touch with a lot of those guys, and just, handling things like Saddam Hussein's personal effects that the 4th Infantry Division brought back from Iraq, and, pretty memorable experiences. Not all of them pleasant, but memorable. And then I moved back home, and I started my own business to do museum consulting and historical research. And that's Bell Heritage. That's my business. And so with Bell Heritage, I can do, programs and provide, create museum exhibits and things like that.
You're able, when somebody says, okay, I have this museum, I have these stories, I have this history, to tell the story in this museum. What you're kind of like an interior decorator almost when it comes to that. Maybe that was a terrible deal, but tell us, how do you do that? What are you looking for?
What I like to do, what I'm passionate about, is telling stories, capturing stories, and interpreting them in the way that the public can understand them. So yes, I have the academic credentials. Yes, I've done all the academic work and what have you, and I can work in that arena without any issues whatsoever. But what I really like to do is take all this massive information and funnel it down into a panel or an exhibit that the general public, a 4th grader, a grandpa, can appreciate and understand, and walk away with, wow, I didn't know that before. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and expect a museum guest to become a expert in the field. They're walking through, they got a couple hours, but if there's something that sparks their interest or something that they learn, they went, oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. My job is done. And I consider museums to be the tip of the spear. It's just to prick a little interest. It's to spark a little thought. And that's it. If you want to go deeper, my goodness, if you want to know about XYZ topic, volumes have been written, whole places have been dedicated to this one topic. But as a museum professional, that's what I really like. So if I go into a community and they say, look, we've got all this stuff everywhere, people donate it to us, or, I've got, all these stories that we've collected, we don't know what to do with it. I like to be able to take it and make it accessible to people. So the Creole book took me 10 years of research. It's a lot of interviews, a lot of going through the archives, a lot of, grinding, grueling work to make something that's accessible, so that anybody who picks it up off the shelf, even if they read the captions of the picture, they might learn something. That's what I like to do. And so the museum is the same thing. Typical museums, you only have about 10% of the entire collection on exhibit. The rest of it's in storage. for preservation purposes, rotating out, whatever. There's many reasons for that. So I like to, cherry pick the 10%. Like, this will best tell this story and best represent these people or what have you. And so that's what I enjoy doing, that kind of work. And I've worked for state parks, I've worked for national parks, I've done living history programs all over the country. I mean, if I dress in a historical clothing and camp somewhere for the weekend and we see, 1,200 children come through on a field trip and they all go, wow, that's so cool. My job is done.
Hey, I love it. I mean, I love the whole deal, and Vermilionville, what a great representation and educational deal for us over there too. I know you worked there for a while. Tell us about your book.
The children's book?
Sure.
Okay, well, yeah, Josette and Friends Cook a Gumbo. It's a children's book, and I sat on this for, actually, I had the idea for this before I even started the Creole book. And the joke is my mom was like, well, that's nice you wrote that book. It's nice you finished your dissertation, but where's the kids' book? Because that's what I'm waiting on. And so so the idea was in the brain pan for a while, and I just didn't know how I wanted to frame it. And during COVID, it just kind of like, this is how I want to approach the topic, because I am a historian. And I want to make sure that the cultures are represented well and accurately, not unfairly, overinflating the stories or what have you. But so I wrote the book, and the whole concept is, it's historical, but told in a way that it's accessible for children. So Josette is a little Cajun girl, Andre is Creole, Isabel is Spanish Isleño from the Canary Islands, Dirk is German, and Tallulah is Houma Choctaw.
Nice.
And so each of these children, and this is not, I didn't have to come up with a story and force something. Like, this is the actual story. Like, the Indians contributed sassafras. The Africans, contributed okra. The Germans had, cultivated rice commercially. These are the stories in Louisiana. And so as these children are coming together and they're preparing our state dish, they're talking about their history and how their families came to Louisiana, and they're, how all of these cultures have interacted and come up with gumbo, which is
brilliant,
amazing. And speaking of John Folse, it's funny you should mention him because he endorsed the book.
Did he?
He did.
I bought a book. I didn't recognize that.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet John?
Oh yeah. And the woman who actually does the writing, all the history and stuff like that, is a very good friend of one of my dearest friends. So I met her. We've hung out. Oh yeah, we are the same people. we both love to travel. We both love history and culture. So, but yeah, through the pages, again, it's beautiful illustrations. The artist did an amazing job. But just take this page, for example, telling the African story of how they came across. They brought okra, barrels of okra seeds, cultivated okra. It is what it is. And the African word for okra is gumbo, which is how we get the word. So people gumbo is a purely Cajun dish. Well, actually, even the word is African. So there's that. And it's ironic, though, because the only critique that I've ever heard, and this didn't come to me, this came through another source, but the only critique that I heard was somebody got extremely offended that I talked about the Africans coming over as slaves when that's how they got to Louisiana. And it was a white person who was extremely offended that I would talk about slavery in a book because she had... she just thought that had no place in a children's book. And I said, well, I can't explain how they got here otherwise. And I think it's more offensive to erase them from the story than to tell the painful truth.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to tell you the truth, even though it hurts, even though it makes you feel uncomfortable. And I've taught in Africa. I've got brothers in Africa. Like, literally, we would go places and stuff, and they introduced me as their sister. My mom is their mom. Their kids are my nieces and nephews. Like, we are very much, they come from, I taught in Angola, the country, not the state penitentiary. And they are my family. Those are my brothers. And they were so excited when I put pictures of Angola, talking about, Angola State Penitentiary and how the name came from the country Angola. They were honored. It's like, you mentioned us. You gave us a space in there. They couldn't believe it. So, but yeah, John Folse endorsed the book. He looked over the recipe in the back of it, and he's like, "Yep, that's a great recipe. That's very, like, that's your typical recipe." I said, "Well, it's my family, so I know it's good, but thank you for the endorsement." So,
Oh yeah,
really
look, I
sweet.
love him. Yeah, I have all
He's
his books when me and my wife lived in Pierreport while she was in med school. He had his restaurant right down the road before it burned down. That was a sad
oh,
day, but
he's as far as a historian in food ways.
yeah.
I mean, I can't think of anybody who
Oh,
knows
I know.
more and has done more.
I would love to have a long conversation with him, but so what's next on your agenda, busy lady?
So many ideas in the brain pan.
Mm-hmm.
Just try to find the time to make them all happen. Right now, I'm just I've got like so many things going on. I've got more living history programs coming up. Doing book tours with the Gumbo book, with the children's book. Getting into schools and like last year, I did a whole series for Evangeline Parish on Evangeline. The myth and the maiden, because I love myth busting and talking about the
I
truth
know you
about
do.
things. So the truth
So
is
you're
so
in
much
St.
better.
Martin Parish, the story of Evangeline, or
So I was Evangeline Parish. I did a series of lectures for all of their library systems, all their libraries, and then they liked it so much they had me come back and do a program for all of their
great,
schools.
yeah.
Because these kids didn't know who Evangeline was, and they live in Evangeline Parish.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was fun. And I dressed in the historic clothing, and I didn't have the Evangeline costume because I explained what that was versus the reality of what Acadian women were wearing at the period and all that kind of stuff. And I got them involved, so I'd have them dress up and be the character sometimes, and they would get all embarrassed because fifth graders are so cool, sixth graders are like, ah, and they were
Right.
giggling and so into it. So it's a fun age.
Um, to go back a little bit on our conversation, the whole DNA, 23andMe, and all that kind of stuff. Is there any revealing s- stories that were altered because of DNA truths sometimes? Is that starting to come out? And I say that because I had Miss Lapointe. She wrote a book, and she actually helped solve crimes and helped people find their biological parents, and through the 23andMe gene pools and connecting dots and this and this, and uh, she discovered in trying to find that there was a lot of gene pools that weren't talked about back in the day, and they sort of
Yes.
mysteriously
Popped up.
popped up and moved around, and so I'm wondering if is that changing any of the conversation, or do they just let it go?
No, it's changing the conversation, and I think the younger generation is much more open and willing to discuss it and embrace it, and they feel like it's a disservice not to know. Whereas the older generation was, again, survival mode, didn't talk about things like that, and kept that, kind of hush hush on the side. So there is a definite difference between generations that I've observed and witnessed. And I mean, I know a lady who has discovered her, biological siblings through DNA testing and found her father and all of that, and didn't realize that certain members of the family were family members that were just, frequent guests at the home, kind of a thing, and until the funeral. And the inheritance started coming out, and then they realized we're related, and some wouldn't acknowledge each other, and that sort of thing. So that's a thing. It's and it has very practical implications.
Oh yeah.
So it's important. And then there's someone that I talked to just a few weeks ago who I gave a presentation about Creoles, and she talked to me afterwards, and she said, "I just want to tell you thank you." She said, "Because I've never looked like the rest of my family, and they try to tell me I'm Italian or something like that, and I know I'm not." And she said, everything you said just makes sense. Like, I understand now why, my cousins called me names, while my grandmother, and this is a different story from the one I was telling you about. This is a different young
Yeah.
woman. I mean, and I told her, I said, if it's any comfort at all, you are not alone. And she said, actually, I felt alone my whole life because I really never looked like everyone else. But now I understand why. And she asked me, and I said, well, I'm not a genealogist. That's not what I do. There is a distinct difference. I said, but I can point you in a direction, and I wish you the best. And so I connected her with someone that I think is doing reputable work, and she's so excited. She said, they wouldn't talk about it because everyone else,
Yeah.
looked different from me, and so they never wanted to talk about why I look the way I look. And she said, but I know I'm not Italian. I said, no, with a surname like that, you are definitely not Italian.
Right.
So,
Yeah, the name of the book was The Gene Hunter, and
okay.
she was fascinating, and but she told many stories on the podcast. Maybe you can listen to it one day. But she found some points matched up, and so she said, okay, it's got to be this lady has to be the mother of this child. And she calls her. She says, hey, I'm Cheryl LaPointe. I'm just helping this person place. Nobody wants anything, whatever, but or did you have a daughter? And she's like, well, no, I would know if I had a daughter and this and that.
Right.
And she was like, okay, do you have a sister? And no, but and so she said, well, look, here's my number. If you think of someone, let me know. And she said, sure enough, about 3 months later, she called and crying, and so how many of those stories? But she says it's pretty thick in Acadiana.
Yeah. Well, I always joke when people are like, well, I'm pure Creole or I'm pure Cajun or I'm pure whatever. I said, well, somebody jumped the fence at some point. So I don't think anybody's quite pure in that sense. We're too blended here. That's why
Well,
you
somebody said
can't hold
that
it against them and you can't elevate them because of it. They have no control over that.
well, one of the quotes in your book is, honey, we's all Creoles. That's the best. That's the best.
Yep.
Well, look, I can keep you here for hours, but I do appreciate you coming by. And what a great body of work you've done and that you're still doing. So thank you for being a great ambassador for our area. And we're here at the cafe. That's what we're trying to do. Is really, I'm trying to drill into the subcultures around, because Acadiana is different now than it was. I mean, we think of Acadiana somehow. I know, Mama, I'll speak for myself. I'm back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s over here, But the truth is, the truth is that in the last, say, 50 years, they had the fall of Saigon, so tons of Vietnamese, huge Latino community, robust Laotian community. I'm leaving a whole bunch of folks out, but that's part of Acadiana now.
Absolutely.
And so today's Acadiana, we're trying to just use this as a small place to sort of have these conversations. When you have a festival, even everybody's still segregated, you know what I mean? And so what we want to try to do is just have a deeper conversation here. So, you ever thought about doing a podcast?
It's funny you should mention that. Just last week or the week before, I had several people tell me, you should do a podcast. I said, I've never done that. They said, you just know so many things about so many things about so many things. You would be so interesting to listen to. I said, well, I've never done that, but I wouldn't say I would never do it. It's just nothing.
I think you should. I would encourage you to do it. I mean, especially bringing in, that's my dog trying to chime in.
He seconds your opinion.
Yeah,
apparently.
he does. Maggie. Anyway, I wish you would.
Well,
Dr. East, thank you so much for stopping by the cafe. Will you come back again, because we have some more things to talk about?
Sure. And
we'll try our best.
Yes. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate you having me, and I appreciate you being so supportive of the work that I've done. And it's always nice to meet people who are like-minded in trying to do the good.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Any parting words or anything you want to tell the guest or anything?
I just, like I said before, I think it's really important that we understand the past and understand that we can't change what happened then, but that we can change for the future.
Yes, ma'am.
We can
I
impact
agree.
our world for the better today.
Yes, we can. We plan on doing that.
Yes,
We're
that's
gonna
great.
do it.
That's great.
All right. Get the app, Cafe Detente LA. We have a ton of events coming up. Check out some more of the Bobcast. We have the Cafe Chronicles, which is our newspaper. And so if you get the app, you'll see that the newspaper is just amateur people gathering information, and we're basically reporting to ourselves. So it's a cool thing that we want to put some legs on that this year as well. Thank you, Dr. East, for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.